Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. We're just waiting for folks to join today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. We will get started in just 1 minute, allowing folks to join us. Please feel free to use the chat if you'd like to introduce yourselves and let us know where you're joining us from today. Again, we'll get started in just 1 minute. Thanks, everyone, for joining. All right, everybody, just giving folks the opportunity to join, see those numbers raising. Please feel free to use the chat if you'd like to tell us where you are joining in today. We appreciate the opportunity for you to join us. And we'll get started in just 1 moment. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot to get to today. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Rural Opportunity and Development session on Seizing the Moment, Rural Development Hubs, and the Historic Opportunity for Federal Resources. My name is Bonita Robertson Hardy, and I am Co-Executive Director at the Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group. We are pleased to have so many people joining us on today's webinar, and we would like to thank our partners, Rural LISC, the International Economic Development Council, Rural Community Assistance Partnership, the Housing Assistance Council, and the Federal Reserve Board of Governors for their partnership in making these road webinars possible. These webinars all work to illuminate and advance rural development ideas and strategies that are critical to rural development progress and success. Today, we will have a panel discussion for an hour, followed by optional breakout sessions. Each Roads webinar provides an opportunity for peer exchange and discussion through the use of our breakout rooms. And following today's main discussion, we will have the opportunity to do so, giving you all the opportunity to ask follow-up questions of today's speakers and to share some of your perspectives as well. We will provide detailed instructions on how to join the breakout sessions at the end of today's webinar, But in the meantime, please use the Q&A box to ask questions of our moderator as well as our panelists. And just a note that we will also have questions, time for questions at the end of the webinar. We will also be sharing resources in the chat, and you are also welcome to share your insights via the chat box as well. So, with all of that, I'd like to all the housekeeping down, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's session and welcome Roque to join us on screen. Roque Barros is the Executive Director of the Imperial Valley Wellness Foundation, which was formed to advance the health and wellness of vulnerable populations in Imperial County, California. Roque brings a wealth of experience through his work leading nonprofits and foundations, and we are so happy to have him here with us today. Hi, Roque, how are you?
Good. Thank you so much, Benita. Pleasure to be here.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we're so happy to have you. And I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to moderate today's conversation. And I wanted to ask you, in your role at Imperial Valley Wellness Foundation, why is this conversation that we're having today, or we're going to get into today, so important to your work?
Well, it's very critical right now for us. I think there's a lot of attention focused on the Imperial Valley. Many of you might have heard, the exploration of lithium in the Imperial Valley has brought a lot of attention to us. We've had visits from the U.S. Secretary from the Department of Energy, a lot of our political representatives, governor, and so forth. And so some of these communities that live along the Salton Sea, so some of you might know about the Salton Sea, but they're unincorporated areas that are frontline communities to the Salton Sea that have had very little voice and visibility. And so I think that this, hearing about, the panelists and these organizations that we're going to hear about today, is very timely for us because these communities, small communities, are getting together and trying to make sure that they're not left further behind. And so, especially in a moment like this where there's so much attention, is how do they make sure that they're in these conversations and that they know how to connect. And so I think that this is going to be really important for all of us in the Imperial Valley.
Absolutely, absolutely. We are so excited about the conversation today, and I think it's going to be so helpful for all of us, all of those who are on the call today, as well as those that can look at the webinar after. When we talk about this work, in 2019, Community Strategies Group published what we call the Rural Development Hubs Report, which really dives into special intermediaries that work within a region, and they do development differently. They do economic development differently. They really are working to build the wealth of communities, the capacity of communities, and the opportunities within communities. And within that work, we talked about how there is really how you think about communities moving from transactional to really transformational. And I know that this is something that's near and dear to your heart. And I just wanted to know, how are you thinking about moving from transactional to transformational, particularly in your new role as president of the Imperial Valley Wellness Foundation?
Yeah, well, so the Imperial Valley Wellness Foundation, we're not, we serve as a grant maker, but also as a rural development hub. And that role is very critical, right now, again, as I mentioned, because as a rural development hub, one of the things that we do is, and I know, many of you do this as well, is you really go to where the people are, right? And you really help, and you start with what they know and build on what they have. And I think as a rural development hub, that's a critical role, right? And I say, we're all of, in your report, the report that was done, and I was part of that report, is that we're connectors, we're conveners, and we're change makers. I was just in a community yesterday or 2 days ago, actually three of the smallest communities in the Imperial Valley. I was gathered with them because they have not sat at the table. They haven't been included in those conversations. And even themselves, they were really happy. I mean, some of these communities, the population is, one of them is 200, the other one is 500, and the other one's a little bit larger. It's got 3,500, but they themselves had not sat together, and they were just really excited about coming together as the smaller communities and having a voice, and then trying to figure out how collectively can they then join some of the other conversations. And so I think that that's really a critical piece, is how do you help them feel comfortable in a way to join the other tables and the other conversations that are happening.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a wonderful place for us to end and start the larger conversation. So, Roque, I'm turning the reins over to you to get us started.
Great. Well, it's a great pleasure again to have some wonderful panelists. And so this morning, we're actually going to start with the Mountain Plains Regional Native CDFI Coalition. And so our panelists for that, as you can see here on the screen, they include Jael Camphy, who is the Regional Competitiveness Officer for the Mountain Plains Regional Native CDFI Coalition and President of Indigenous Impact Company. We also have with her Eric Swack, who is the Executive Director, who's the CEO of Mountain Plains CDC and a member of the coalition comprised of 9 additional Native CDFIs from North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming. And the coalition recently received a $45 million Build Back Better regional grant from the Economic Development Administration to support their efforts. So I want to welcome both of them, and we'll start by asking them to share their story of how the coalition is fortifying an Indigenous finance industry and building on their unique assets while honoring their history and culture. So Jael and Eric.
Thank you, Roque. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to share with colleagues in this space today. We're going to run through some slides as way of introduction to the coalition and our shared work together in the Mountain Plains region. Next slide. So the coalition was formed in February of 2020, just a couple of weeks before the pandemic started. and came together as a peer-to-peer support network to start looking at how to grow the industry across the region and to leverage each other's resources, grow collective capacity, and to work together to leverage larger dollars. One of the challenges for rural work, if you can go back one slide, please, is that we don't have the numbers to often leverage the larger scale dollars, but that by coming together collectively, we would be able to show the scale of impact that could leverage and unlock resources to start meeting the need. The coalition is comprised of NACDC in Browning, Montana, up on the Blackfeet Reservation, Montana Native Growth Fund, located on the Fort Belknap Reservation, NADC, located in Billings, Montana, Plenty Doors Community Fund, located on the Crow Reservation, People's Partners for Community Development on Northern Cheyenne, a Keepton, which is located on Cheyenne River and serving a national market for ag lending, Four Bands Community Fund, also located in Cheyenne River, Black Hills Community Loan Fund in Rapid City, and Wind River Development Fund in Wyoming, as well as the Mountain Plains CDC that Eric is the executive director for. Next slide. This slide gives a summary and a little bit of a picture of the scale of systemic issues that we're trying to tackle. And when you look at the racial wealth gap and the impact that that's having in Native communities in our region, you can start to see that it's not sufficient enough to take an approach on an organizational level, that we have to start coming together and working collectively if we're going to impact systemic change. Next slide. Part of what is contributing to those dire statistics is the part of the ecosystem that is often fueled by philanthropy, banks, and impact investing. That right now, according to a Bush Foundation data collection process, less than 0.4% of private funding is going to support Native organizations. Redlining, which is often seen as historic, I think continues to happen in our contemporary settings. And you see that banking institutions continue to not serve reservation communities. And so in order to change the indicators on the previous slide, we as an ecosystem that is fueling an Indigenous finance industry have to work together to do better and be better. Next slide. So in coming together, we really started talking about systems change work and what does it take? It requires a collective approach. It means that as CDFIs, that everyone needs to work together and start thinking about how to scale collective solutions, but also how to leverage the entire ecosystem so that we engage as colleagues. It also means that we need to re-examine what are the underlying values and cultural agreements that are informing this system. That if you look at those prior statistics, there's some assumptions and values that created the systems that yielded that scale of poverty. And in order for us to do it differently, we have to forward and promote and work from a different set of values. And lastly, is that we think a lot about the importance of Native innovation and centering Native innovation. Colonial capitalism was founded on the backs of slavery and on stealing of resources from Indigenous peoples. And we can't continue to perpetuate capital flows that are perpetuating similar concepts. We believe that Native leaders are closest to the most harm done by these practices and consequently are closest to the greatest solutions. Next slide. These are some of the values that we center in our collective work together. And I want to highlight the importance of reciprocity, that we believe that we are not going to successfully redistribute wealth until we successfully redistribute power. And that requires that when we're interfacing with our funding partners, that we interface as colleagues and that we stop creating a hierarchy of power where power equates with those with money, but that instead we come together as colleagues within this same ecosystem, problem solving together and understanding that solutions require both of us and a heavy lift by both of us. Next slide. Part of what's unique about the Native CDFI industry is the leadership of Native women, that whereas only 7% of leadership roles in dominant culture financial systems are held by women, within the Native CDFI industry nationally, 72% of those positions are held by women. And we think that that really matters, that when we look at the type of innovation that's coming out of the coalition, it is uniquely responsive to the way in which women lead. An example of that is we're developing curriculum and professional development strategies to do a trauma-informed approach to lending, looking at the way in which trauma ends up being embedded within our financial systems, and that we need to disentangle that to be able to better serve our communities. Next slide. As we're working together, we also center some core tenets that no matter what we touch, we always start with data and start with assessment, believing that data sovereignty is key to systemic change, particularly for Native communities and Native organizations. We work on an ecosystem level, that we don't do the work alone. We always bring others because that's how you build a new system to replace harmful systems. It's imperative that we leverage resources, that the scale of the problem requires a scaling of access to resources and access to capital, and that we also share our story, that we know that systems change requires a narrative change, and that we need to tell stories differently and collectively. As we work together, we try to create a balance between what we term our three-strand braid, which is amplify strength on the organizational level so that each member of the coalition is getting stronger as an organization, that we unify action and find ways to fortify the Indigenous finance industry together, and that we're taking a long-term approach, that we're looking at systems change that will lead to sustaining generations. Next slide. How we're doing this. So as we are fortifying the Indigenous finance industry, we're focused on 5 areas of capacity building. First, we're building intellectual capital through data, storytelling, and I'm missing one other. Strategy, thank you. Human capital through workforce development and professional development. Shared capacity through our CDC and shared service entity that Eric is providing leadership for. Through physical infrastructure, that we need our Native CDFIs to become community developers. And lastly, through financial resources, that we're growing a regional revolving loan fund, increasing regional circulation of dollars, and ultimately looking at building out a secondary market. Next slide. So the last thing I want to do is just invite others to join, that the way that we're approaching this is replicable, it's built on trust, it centers relationship, and that it's really exciting work. We've been able to leverage the largest single investment into the native CDFI industry ever made. And with it is really changing the way in which we can approach actually building an industry that we think will be transformative, not only for our region, but really as a national model. Last slide. And there's the members of our coalition. Eric, any summary points that I didn't touch that you want to add to?
Yeah, no, I think that just reinforcing the importance of starting with relationships, showing up, and that I think the most important part of the coalition has been the peer-to-peer learning and support, and that if you can build that foundation, there's value in something like that. Funding opportunities come much more naturally.
Great. Thank you so much, JL and Eric. You have a question, Eric? I know that in some of the conversations we've had that that the Mountain Plains CDC is serving or is providing to the coalition shared services to the members. Can you talk a little bit more about how that operates?
Yeah. So I had previously been the executive director at Wind River Development Fund, which is one of the coalition members, and WRDF is the only CDFI in the state of Wyoming. Well, they're the only loan fund, and there just lack this ecosystem, the resources, the know-how to actually operate in the most effective way. And I think when the coalition began, it was this sort of revelation that that there are other folks out there that have the same problems, and we're working towards the same solutions, and that by dint of serving small rural communities, we were all limited in the size of our own organizations to both access specialists, but then to further cultivate them. I didn't have a pipeline for recruiting for employees. I didn't have a sort of roadmap for capitalization best practices. I didn't have a whole host of sort of specialists needs that larger organizations oftentimes have. In-house counsel, and it turns out we all had that. And so the idea behind the jointly held CDC, because we incorporated it so it's cooperatively held, where board members are comprised of the other coalition members, so it's directly accountable to member needs. And we're working at just that. How do we provide those services that allow us to scale and better serve our community?
Great. Thank you for that. And then I know we've only got like 1 more minute left, but real quickly, I know you talked about JL, you talked about systems change and a different set of values. And I know you say a little bit about your relationship with the EDA.
Yes, so it's been a wonderful opportunity to strengthen and work in partnership with EDA to strengthen some of their systems. And the revolving loan fund is a great example of that the RLF has not been largely accessed by Native organization, and it has to do with some systemic barriers. And so we've been working with EDA as we finalize our RLF plan with them to help them learn more about Native markets and how to adapt some of their, it's not yet at a policy level, it's really on their interpretation of policy to be more inclusive. One example is the inclusion of trust land to be able to leverage it as collateral. Trust land is a uniquely Native characteristic, and the exclusion then leads to racial barriers without having it be included. Another example is including access, being able to include refinancing, that predatory lending happens disproportionately at larger scale within reservation communities and impacting tribal lending, and consequently needs to be included as one of the sound economic justifications for use of RLF dollars. So those are two examples.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, JL and Eric. Really happy to hear, and definitely there's a lot we need to continue to learn from your coalition. So thank you so much. So we're moving on now to our next panelist members. And so our next presenters are from Coalfield Development, and we welcome Brandon Dennison, who is the CEO of Coalfield Development, and Marilyn Wren, who's the Chief Program Officer of Coalfield Development. Their work and project is located in Central Appalachia, and they have been successful in creating a coalition of innovative CBOs, plus the state's two largest universities, 2 unions, and nearly 50 private companies that came together to form ACT Act Now Coalition. They were awarded a grant of $62.8 billion. And I welcome both of them, and we'll start out by asking them to share their story of how they were able to build this coalition, successfully get funded, and how the work is moving forward. Brandon, Marilyn?
Well, thanks so much for this opportunity. And this is a great topic. I think these are historic times for rural development. I really believe that. I think we'll look back many years from now at the investments, the place-based investments that are getting made, and hopefully see this as a turning point for rural America. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to start with our one organization story, and then I'll build on what JL and Eric just said, which is that ultimately it has to be much more than just one organization. So I'll start with our very grassroots story, and then I'll build towards this historic coalition that we're now a part of called ACT Now, which stands for Appalachian Climate Technologies. Coalfield Development as an organization began in 2010. It began as an all volunteer effort. And we are in Central Appalachia. We're specifically in Southern West Virginia. This is coal country, traditionally. So the reason our organization is called Coalfield Development is because we're located in the part of the state known as the coal fields. And yet we don't want to stay just that. We believe we can be much more than just that. We are working for economic diversification and economic opportunity for marginalized people from a place that's really been dominated by one industry for generations. So the coal industry has, really in many ways, we've become a mono economy. So the infrastructure we have is really designed to extract and ship out coal, and the education and training system we have is really designed to train coal miners. And the banking and financing and public investment system we have has really been built here in the southern part of the state around the coal industry. And so we're trying to cast a vision in a very tangible and grassroots way for a new economy and a better economy, a more fair economy and a more just economy, and a more sustainable economy. So when we started as volunteers, it was in just one county. In 2010, that county had 3 coal mines, easily the largest private employer in the county. And by 2015, all 3 of those mines had closed, thousands of lost jobs, extreme disinvestment, historic unemployment. And so Coalfield Development really emerged as a problem solver in this very difficult scenario. And our strategy is to create social enterprises. And these enterprises are meant to, 1, model what that new and more diversified economy can look like, and 2, to directly employ unemployed people who face barriers to employment, and really use that employment opportunity as a way to not just have a job, but to have the personal, professional, and academic support needed to really be on a pathway, a trajectory towards a good paying career that can support a family and really honor the dignity and the agency of our people. So if we go to the next slide, these are some of the outcomes since 2010 that we've achieved, but the numbers are good, but I'm most proud of the human stories behind these numbers. So if we keep going here, we organize this organization around 4 core capabilities. And so I'm going to go a little bit deeper with each of those capabilities now. The next slide talks about our first capability, which is incubating social enterprises. So you'll hear in a little bit, workforce development is a key aspect of our work, and there is a great need for that. But the reality is a lot of job training communities in West Virginia, a lot of job training programs in West Virginia communities have not been terribly effective. And I think it's for 2 main reasons. One, in many cases, the job training was not leading to actual employment opportunities. And 2, the job training was not accounting for what I call the human element, the deep human barriers, the trauma, the disinvestment, the marginalization that is keeping people out of the workforce and keeping people from thriving as human beings. And so our idea was not just to train people and hope there were jobs out there to place people in, but to create actual employers, social enterprises in sustainable sectors that could model what a new, more just, more sustainable economy could look like, but also create the human affirming job opportunities that are needed to get people off the sidelines and back in the workforce and to be well as people. So for example, we helped start the first solar company in Southern West Virginia. That company, Solar Holler, now has more than 100 full-time employees. These are IBEW union jobs, and we are on track to top 200 by the end of this year. We have a construction company. We have a local agriculture program. We've started a furniture making home goods company. We've done light manufacturing. So these are new sectors that have not been traditionally a part of the West Virginia economy, but that prove very tangibly what a new economy can look like. So you're gonna hear me use the word tangible over and over and over again, and it's really key to our theory of change, which is that you cannot ask an entire community to turn away from something like coal or a fossil fuel without providing something to turn toward. And so we create these social enterprises, these sustainable programs to offer an alternative and a very tangible example of what this new economy looks like. So on the next slide, I'll talk about how the social enterprises then create workforce development opportunities for people who face barriers. More than half our participants are in recovery from substance use disorder, and more than a quarter are justice system involved, and nearly all are unemployed or underemployed at the time they start with us. I'd like to pass to Marilyn to talk about our RAPS program. She's the innovator of it.
Thanks, Brandon. Hey, everyone. Good to be here with you today. As Brandon was talking about, the importance of connecting job training with real world experience and real world opportunity, and hiring people and immediately setting them on a path where they can earn and learn is very important. And we have 2 programs through which we do that. We started off with one, you'll see on the slide there, it says 33, 6, and 3, which was an innovative approach to help people engage in workforce training. 33 hours a week. We would pay people, and still do, pay people to engage in on-the-job training with one of our enterprises or programs. The 6 is 6 hours of higher education work that people committed to do, either to gain their associate's degree or a VOTEC trade skill that required many months of pursuit, and then 3 hours of personal development. And we ran with just the 33-6-3 program for several years and iterated it as we went. And it would take about between 1 and 3 years for people to actually achieve the higher education goal. It was putting people to work directly and immediately, and then also starting that higher education piece immediately. And upon reviewing the outcomes, we realized that a lot of people really needed an on-ramp to our 33-6-3 program. So we invented RAPS, which stands for Workforce Readiness and Professional Success, which is a 6-month prerequisite program to give people a chance to step into workforce development and training. You'll see there on the slide that It's similar to 33.6 and 3 in that it still includes the 33 hours of paid work and training a week and the 3 hours of personal development. It does not have the higher education component, but what it does have is up to 4 hours or 104 hours over 6 months of paid time where people can work with our human development staff to really dig down and understand their trauma, understand their situations, set goals for themselves that we call milestones, and really use that time to overcome these milestones or overcome these barriers to long-term employment success. So we help people remove barriers such as getting their driver's license or having that driver's license reinstated, understanding fines that they may have acquired throughout their life up to this point. We help people get permanent housing, understand child care issues that they may have, child support issues that they may be facing. So we really dig down, and after that 6 months where they've done this deep work, they're better prepared to step into our 3363 program, or they're better prepared to step into employment with a member of our employer network, which we're also simultaneously building, because we work often on both sides of the equation. We're building a pipeline of workers, but we're also building a pipeline of employers, and we're working with them to be high quality employers and understand what trauma-informed employment looks like. We're helping them revise and improve their human development and personal their policies around how their employees are treated. So it's both sides of that equation there that we're concentrating on with our workforce.
Thank you, Marilyn. It's such good stuff. Transformational is not an overly dramatic word for what happens with our participants. So if we go to the next slide, our work is transformational on a human individual level. It's transformational on a community level. So we do real estate revitalization projects. These projects employ local people through our construction enterprise, and they become the HQ for the social enterprises and programs that we're launching. So now, building to the next slide, the coalition, the impact gets much bigger than just our one organization. So we're a part of the Appalachian Climate Technologies Coalition. And this is about building the climate resilient economy from Southern West Virginia. We're taking what's been known as the coal fields, and our argument is our energy communities can lead this transition to cleaner energy. We're going to stay in energy state, but the kinds of energy we produce are going to change, and they're going to become more sustainable and more resilient. And we believe our communities and our local economies can be stronger and better than they ever were, even when coal boomed. So the next slide shows this incredible partnership. You heard some of the partners that are in it. I really want to emphasize the importance of the community-based organizations that form the core of this coalition. The West Virginia Community Development Hub, Generation West Virginia. We have 2 unions that are involved, really doing the scrappy, nimble, on the ground work to collaborate, to build trust, to work through problems, to communicate transparently, and to really set a new vision for this region. So ACT now consists of 8 different projects. 4 are construction projects and 4 are non-construction projects. And this is historic funding. This is one of the largest investments in the climate tech sector for Central Appalachia that's ever been made, nearly $100 million when you include match, and we're talking economic outcomes, environmental outcomes, community outcomes. So that's the Act Now Coalition, and happy to take questions.
Great, thank you so much for that. I know that there was a question in there. I don't know if you got it, Marilyn, if you were going to answer that question.
Yeah.
Is the barrier?
I'd be happy to. Yeah. We work with and actually recruit from a lot of the recovery service providers in our ecosystem. And while our particular human development doesn't include active recovery, we make sure that the people that we hire are in active recovery support. That's a real important part of the model. The counseling, the human development work that we do is really walking beside people to help them understand how to navigate systems on their own. You know, whether it's a bureaucracy that that's hard for any of us to navigate, but especially if you're under-resourced and perhaps have had bad experiences with bureaucracies, we really do the work of helping people feel their own power and to understand their own strengths and to answer their own questions as they overcome these milestones. And we've worked really hard to develop on-ramps and off-ramps for people who are in recovery. And if someone comes out of recovery and they have a situation, we have put in place, and we're working with other employers to put in place ways for people to remain connected to their employment while they take the time they need to get back to a healthier situation and can re-engage. But we're really conscious of the fact that employment is tightly tied to recovery success, and we're trying to do all we can to support that.
Thank you so much for that. We're actually now entering into our sort of moderated questions, and I know some of you sent questions in advance that we'll be discussing. And since staying with the co-field development, in the conversations that we had earlier, there was two things that really struck me, and that was on your key ingredients. One of them, you talked about your governance MOU, and so I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the governance structure that you're using in your coalition.
Yeah, so for the Act Now Coalition, we had members sign a formal memorandum of understanding, and we're actually on the third iteration. So it was not a situation where Coalfield Development said, here, sign this. We've really designed it collaboratively. We use consensus decision-making, but we identify voting members, an odd number of voting members, that should consensus not be obtained, we can have a vote and move forward and not grind to a halt. So far, we've not had to vote. We've been able to achieve consensus. And I think the real reason is the first couple pages of the MOU are about our shared principles and strategies. So we share that in common. They're not the same principles as Jael and Eric's coalition, but you know, it's a similar concept of we've come together because we agree on these foundational concepts, and that's what really holds us together.
Great, thank you. Thank you. And so I want to honor the questions that are coming in. So I have one here from Andrew Myers. It says, these are two great examples of rural development and prompting prosperity. But one of the main challenges I hear from my rural partners is just being able to identify and apply for funding opportunities. There is a lot of money available to support rural communities, but many with the most need also lack capacity to navigate varying systems and access these funds. Can any of the panelists speak to successful strategies to build this capacity? First question, and is there any technical assistance available for rural organizations who are seeking to access funds? Anybody from the panel?
I'm happy to respond. I think it's part of the power of coalitions is that I really agree with the hurdle that's been identified. And I think that by coming together and jointly supporting either a position or a consultant or a shared resource that can go over after shared resources, that can be a strategy that can be very effective. And I think that it's also by having a shared resource dedicated to this, not only do you have more of that advocacy piece jointly funded, but also looking for shared resources that can be applied. The second thing that I would say is around a peer-to-peer network is that as a coalition, we meet weekly, and whenever anyone identifies a funding opportunity, they share it with the whole group, and really have been moving from competition to collaboration and recognizing that if everyone has access to this resources, you know, we're stronger together.
I absolutely agree with Jill, with what you said, that, that this kind of, opportunity and application wouldn't be possible without, those coalition relationships in place. I also think that, our experience has been very similar. Like, it was not easy. That, like, the way that we applied for this was, technically the Build Back Better grant was 5 different grants, and we got some consulting help, one individual, but largely we wrote this ourselves. We we all got on a Zoom call on like a Tuesday night, and sent our applications into the abyss. And I think there's an element of, yes, we were able to leverage the coalition and our strength to apply, but I also think there's real work to be done, that federal entities have to meet us halfway and design programs and application systems that work for us, that are boots on the ground in very small communities that have limited capacity. And I actually think that it's a real testament to EDA that through this first 9 months of the process, they've continued to show up. I think that's been, they've, I think, really taken to heart what being a funding partner is. And so I hope that in addition to modeling coalition building as a method of channeling money into these communities, that that there continues to be work on sort of the other side of continuing to make these programs more accessible.
Great. And Eric and Jill, I know in some of the conversations that we had, or some of the information you said, when you talked about these applications, right, to successfully apply, you said leaders stopped trying to fit into federal boxes that weren't designed to include them or were designed to exclude them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can start on that. There's often a difference, particularly with any opportunities, that you often don't have the writing of the opportunity done by practitioners, done by the person who's going to be the end user and recipient. And when you couple that with rural, that creates more of a differential that's further from what I think how often opportunities are written. And then if you layer on that native and tribal, it's even a greater disparity. And so I think that there's been a lot of trying to do code switching and enter into those spaces and learn how to adapt to whatever those rules and regulations are. And I think that what the coalition is learning is that isn't getting anyone where anybody needs to go, is that it means that it's dampening their expertise, their light, their unique features to try to fit in, as opposed to bringing their authentic full selves that pushes back on systems that don't work, to be a real partner to make these systems better so they can actually be inclusive. And I think that with the rise of sort of what happened with George Floyd, there's been more space in the dialogue and in the national landscape to actually have those conversations and be more authentic and more powerful as partners, I think.
Brandon or Marilyn, would you add anything about the application process?
I would add, we've just worked to really keep an abundance mentality. And I think a lot of times the different nonprofits in a community have been forced to compete against one another, for a very small amount of resources. But that only gets you so far. And so really just trying to shift the mindset to view one another as collaborators, trying to achieve something that's bigger than just our individual organizations. It makes sense. It makes total sense, but it's a little bit easier said than done because we've sort of been forced as nonprofits to bootstrap it and shoestring it for so long. it can be hard collaborative work to shift it, but that constant communication, constantly coming together is how it happens.
Right. And I know that both of you talked about the flexibility that's needed with these federal agencies, and it looks like there's been some flexibility there. I know that with some of the other organizations that I've worked with and community groups, we've heard, yes, we know we need to be more flexible, but sometimes the bureaucracy doesn't allow that to happen, or the guidelines and so forth. But anyway, if you could talk a little bit about the flexibility that you all have been able to achieve.
I can talk about sort of one example in particular is, the guidelines for EDA revolving loan funds are laid out so that they encourage leveraging of private dollars, which is great. Like, you want bang for your buck. And, they were originally written with the idea of, these revolving loan funds can be used as, gap financing, like, 30% under a bank taking 70, whatever. And, that doesn't necessarily work in a community that doesn't have any banks. And so, much as we'd like to lever these funds, that program design, doesn't really work in our geographies, in our communities. And so, being able to work with EDA and explain that, we want to be able to leverage. That's not how this economy works right now, and for them to be responsive and provide for alternative avenues of internally leveraging private funders as part of a single loan. And so I think that's both an example of how regulations can are oftentimes well-meaning but exclusionary, and of being able to work with in this case EDA, federal entity, to sort of massage it to actually get it to work for us.
Great, thank you. And I know both of you mentioned, and one of you specifically, about another key ingredient was this mechanism to keep including more people with an equity focus. Could you share a little bit more about what those mechanisms look like, and how do you make sure that the process continues to be open for others?
Yeah, I mean, one of our core principles is inclusion. And, that doesn't really work if you just say, we're this coalition that formed nearly 2 years ago, and, we were inclusive then, but now we're not adding any new members. That would no longer be adhering to the inclusion principle. So what we did in our MOU, we identified current members who would be voting members. And then we actually purposely left a couple voting slots blank with the intention, purposely leaving space, not just to participate, but to have decision-making authority. So as we expand, and work with new communities and lift up new voices, there's space custom ready. It's already there for folks to plug in and again, not just be invited to the table, but really have a voice and a vote in the decision-making and the problem solving that's happening at that table. It's it purposely adds complexity, I think, to truly commit. We certainly have not figured out entirely how to do that seamlessly. You sort of invite a little bit of messiness, but ultimately it's deeper roots, and it's better change that will stick for a longer period of time.
You're on mute, JL.
Ours is, I think we're still getting our sea legs a little bit. This large funding that we were able to leverage, we're needing to now build our own internal capacity and readiness to really deploy the capital. And so right now it's the 9 members and the shared CDC, but ultimately the plan is to expand beyond that. And part of how we're thinking about it is around model building. is that any individual organization within the coalition is piloting new innovations, and we've got funding for them to pursue them, with the idea that we would then test those ideas through replication within the coalition and then share it out. Through the CDC, we're really piloting a shared service model that we think has, national implications that could be a resource for Native CDFIs across the country. I think that, and then once we are further along, I think that by next year, it might be longer than that, we'll then be expanding to some newer other CDFIs within our region. That with this large funding, there's some limitations in terms of the regional scope, but I think that we're definitely building with the lens for inclusion, but I think even more so as part of inclusion is also impact.
And, so I know, and I congratulate both of you for your ability to build these coalitions. And I know that in some of the smaller communities that I've worked in or that I know of, there's some larger institutions that are already secure state and federal funding. And then you have those smaller community groups that they don't have the experience, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the infrastructure to manage those types of funds or the resources for technical assistance. So you talk a little bit about how you bring those two different players to the same table around in this case, Gail and Eric, your shared values.
Go slowly, get done early. That's a cowboy expression of, like, when you're working cattle, is that you got to take the time it takes. I think that, one of the premises is really around trust and relationship building. And I think too often, particularly in this era of Zoom, we show up to a new meeting with a very tight agenda, and it's very transactional. And that we have a responsibility to slow down conversations so that we're bringing our full humanity to the table, but also that we take the time to agree on some shared values. And that often with new partners, we'll do an entire meeting where we share kind of what the values are that drive our work and ask what their equivalents are for theirs, and look at what we have in common and agree on those as our core tenets as we build partnership going forward. So that's part of what we do and I think it's also understanding the long-term changes. I think too often, particularly in communities of such dire shortfalls of resources, is that we can get too focused on urgency, and that can outweigh importance, and it's not moving the needle. We have to put more time into importance, which is this relationship building piece.
Anybody else on the panel with that? If not, then I'll switch to one of the questions that somebody sent in here about how to engage with local governments, and how have you been effective in doing that?
I'll take that. We started with the community-based organizations, the CBOs, and then tried to pull in the private sector employers and the unions. And then we went to the local and state government and the institutions, but sort of with that strong, what I call nimble adaptive core. So I think a strength of the CBOs that complements some of that institutional capacity is a lot of those institutions just cannot move as quickly as even their own staff want to move. And so for us, it didn't start with the local municipalities. We always intended to incorporate them in, and we have done that. But we really, before we went to the institutions and tried to earn their buy-in, we wanted to have a pretty well refined, thought out concept and show cross-sector buy-in and commitment to it. And we already had lined up some philanthropic match as well. So, it wasn't just sort of a, hey, municipality, can you help us with match? It was a, hey, municipality, we've got this amazing momentum, this historic coalition, and we'd like you to be a part of it. We don't want you to operate it and control it, but also we don't want to just ask you for money and not ask you for your input. We want a genuine partnership. But I think the CBOs can uniquely push and convene that sort of partnership in a way that if it had started with the municipality, I'm not sure it would have worked as well.
Great. Thank you for that, Brandon. And I see that Benita has appeared on the screen, so I know that that means that's our transition now into our breakout sessions. But I do want to thank all of our panelists today for this informative session. And I know that I myself will be reaching out to all of you as we try to learn our way and hopefully have as a remarkable journey as you have. So thank you so much for that. I'll turn it over to Benita.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Roque, and thank you to all of our panelists. There was an amazing number of resources and everything that was shared in the chat, a lot of plus ones to everything that everyone was saying. So thank you for joining us for today's webinar. So as I mentioned at the outset, for our road webinars, we actually love the opportunity to do breakout sessions so that folks can dive a little bit deeper into the insights that were shared by our panelists and our moderator. And so to enter the breakout sessions, you do have to click the link that should be in the chat or coming in the chat soon. We have also sent an email to the folks that registered for this webinar, where you will also have a link to join us for the breakout sessions. Just a reminder, these are completely voluntary. But we offer these as an opportunity to learn from each other, to ask additional questions, share some of your insights as well. Also a note that as you exit this webinar, we are asking for you to fill out a brief survey. It's very short. As we continue to work to improve our webinars that we put on so that these are most useful for you all as our practitioners in the field. So you will get a pop-up survey when you look to exit the webinar. At each breakout session, we'll have a speaker as well as a facilitator. So we'll have some time to ask questions and move through hopefully useful conversation and dialogue. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Please join us for the breakout sessions if you have the time. And that is in the chat box, the link to that, and in your email. So thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you in the breakout sessions. Have a good rest of the day.
Brandon, Marilyn, Eric, go ahead and click that link in the chat.